I was asked to talk about extraordinary renditions and the war on terror. And I'd like to structure my expose first addressing recalling what are extraordinary renditions, what was the war on terror, and how are we accounting with the impact of these extraordinary renditions and the so-called war on terror, and finally, if we are being successful in fighting terrorism. I believe that, I'll start by recalling what were extraordinary renditions. It's the program that was actually started during the Clinton administration, but was dramatically extended in the Bush administration to have people suspected of terrorism be caught, interrogated, subject to harsh treatment, that actually torture, it clearly amounts to torture, and to have it all done outside the US territory so that US authorities could not be responsible for the human rights violations that were obviously involved in that program. And that program, therefore, it was a program for the subcontracting torture to others, subcontracting torture to countries that, and to authorities from countries that are actually nominated in the annual US country reports on human rights as tremendous human rights violators. We know that, for instance, some of these subcontracting authorities to which the US subcontracted the interrogations and the torture were actually the authorities of countries such as Egypt, Syria, Morocco, among others. And of course, this program included a system of black sites, prisons all over the world that were secret until, as you know, finally in 2006, President Bush admitted they existed. There were rumors, there were information, there were articles published in the press pointing out to these secret prisons, the black holes, the black sites. But this had always been denied by all the governments involved, including the Bush administration, until in the autumn of 2006, President Bush himself admitted that there were these secret prisons. Apart from the secret prisons, as you know, there were the obvious, the ostensive prisons that were in the margins of the law. Guantanamo, and it was not by chance that it was in this piece of territory outside the US, although under US administration, that these special facilities were built, but also prisons in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the theaters of war that the US was leading. Of course, we all recall the scandal of Abu Ghraib, Bagram, and so on. This was a program that was, as I said, operated, devised by the US administration, in particular the Bush administration, with the most outrageous elements in it. But it was a program that had the complicity of authorities from other parts of the world, namely those who were taking the contract of interrogating, torturing the people, but also governments who, from democratic countries, were supposed to respect human rights, such as the European governments, who knew about this program, were complicit in the program, who allowed it, either black sites, secret prisons to be operated, and we heard recently Lithuania was the latest to discover and to confirm that indeed these secret prisons existed in its territory. We, in the European Parliament, we highlighted that this was the case definitely of Romania and Poland, despite the denials. Probably there were others, there were certainly in Turkey, and of course all that was only possible to be operated with the complicity of other European governments that were giving the authorization for the passage of the planes with the prisoners, namely to go for Guantanamo, but to go to the prisons in Morocco and to be transferred, and to the CIA crews who were involved in this program of secret prisons and the so-called extraordinary renditions program. Was there a war on terror? Well, this notion, the global war on terror, again, was something that we saw very much in the mouth of all the governments during the Bush era, but it was a notion that was discarded by President Obama when he reached power, because President Obama realized that the use of this notion was very counterproductive, was actually feeding the narrative of terrorists, was actually giving a political status to those involved in those kind of criminal activities, and not really highlighting what was to be highlighted. It was that people involved in terrorism are criminals, and ought to be tried as criminals according to the rule of law, not having any exceptional procedures, but actually be tried as criminals according to the rule of law. And talking about war was something that gave them this kind of political status that was totally incompatible with the fact that this whole extraordinary renditions program was also divided to escape for the US to escape its obligations under the Geneva Convention, the humanitarian law, the law of the war. As you know, the Bush administration denied that the people caught or suspects of terrorism were supposed to be under the Geneva Conventions. So, and this was totally inadequate, the Obama administration said, because obviously when you are fighting terrorism, you know that it's not a military fight. It's not something that you can deal with military means only. It's basically a political and ideological fight. And you need much more than the military means. Sometimes you don't even need military means, but you need the other sorts of tools that are indeed required to face the political and ideological challenge that comes out of the use of terrorism. Well, I think that, let me now turn to, and just mention another thing, often associated to the war on terror, to this notion of war on terror. Now we talk about fight against terrorism or combating terrorism. This is now the discourse of the Obama administration. It also obviously had implications for the discourse of the Europeans. There were many people in Europe who from the beginning also did not agree with this notion of war on terror of the Bush administration, but something which they still today, even today we heard, and it's very normal, probably it's for practical reasons that people often talk about Islamic terrorism. And it's something that to me is very, it's very, it's stigmatizing and incorrect because, well, we know terrorism from all sorts of people who claim all sorts of reasons for their terroristic actions, and all sorts, and they invoke religion as well for their terrorist actions. We never thought of calling what was happening in Northern Ireland Catholic terrorism or Christian terrorism. So in this sense, it's very wrong to actually talk about Islamic terrorism for actions that obviously are not condoned by a religion like Islam. And I say that I may have a particular sensibility because I lived in the biggest Muslim country in the world, which is Indonesia. I am not a religious person, but I grew to respect very much the attachment to religion, the devotion to religion that I saw in the Indonesians, and that religion being mainly Islam. It's indeed quite outrageous to link the religion to Islam. These people claim that Islam is the basis for their action, but obviously they are not acting in accordance with the rulings of Islam. And besides, I have also seen in Indonesia, and we see that in all parts of the world, that the highest number of victims of the terrorism by people that claim to act on behalf of Islam are actually Islam followers, are Muslim followers. That if you see the percentage of victims of terrorism in the last 10 years since of the 9/11s, you find that many more people in Muslim countries have been the victims of terrorism than actually in the West. And therefore, one more reason why I think we should not use the word Islamic terrorism. We should be careful on that. Let me turn now to my part where are we actually accounting for the mistakes that we did during these Bush years, and that actually go on in some respect till this day with the extraordinary renditions and the way the whole fight against terrorism was operated at that time. I'm sorry to say that my judgment is pretty negative. And this is because, for different reasons. And this is despite the fact that even recently, last June, the European Union and the Obama administration put out a very good statement, joint declaration on combating terrorism. This was adopted during the Spanish presidency in last June, and that declaration explicitly recognizes now that, and I quote, the respect for the rule of law and international law, including human rights law, international humanitarian law, and refugee law, are fundamental in the national and international efforts in the fight against terrorism and are the basis of our shared action. And actually, that the declaration goes behind it exactly because Obama had already discarded the notion of war on terror. Both US and EU in this declaration were able to agree that, and I quote again, to avoid impunity in the fight against terrorism, the state whose personnel are alleged to have committed abuses relating to efforts to combat terrorism as the responsibility in the first instance for the investigation and consideration of criminal prosecution of such conduct. So therefore, there's even an element to say that the people in our countries who are responsible for the fight against terrorism and who actually abuse individual rights, human rights, are actually liable for their responsibility. And the declaration even says that commitment to implement prohibitions on torture, as well as on cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of punishment. So that actually, it's a warning to the security personnel, the intelligence officials involved in the fight against terrorism, both in the US and the EU, that they are liable if they do violate basic law and human rights. It's important. But is it in fact having an impact? Is this just words? And are we seeing this being put into practice? And here I must say, unfortunately, no. This is not the case in the Obama administration. We fear that the Obama administration is backtracking on the commitments. We know that President Obama promised to have Guantanamo closed in 1 year. He didn't, and he didn't because he hesitated. He was succumbed to pressure from different quarters, namely in Congress, where Republicans, but not only Republicans, also some Democrats were very active and therefore led President to hesitate. We see as well that President Obama has not been able, as he wanted, to resettle Guantanamo detainees in the US territory for trial by federal courts. Not even the Chinese Uyghurs, and the Chinese Uyghurs are completely clean of any accusations, and the Chinese Uyghur community in the US was ready to integrate these people, to help them settle and so on, but not even those people were able to be transferred back to the US because the Obama administration again deterred on, with this pressures, political pressures. Also, now we see the Obama administration considering what is incredible, the indefinitive detention. And you know about this Thompson Correction Facility, which was acquired by the administration, and it was supposed to actually hold their people, not the people that would be brought to trial, but actually people that would be in indefinite detention. This is absolutely inconsistent with international obligations by the US. It's quite disheartening that the Obama administration is now considering this. Also, President Obama, although he suspended for a while the military commissions, he reenacted them, and they are now operating. One of the cases in front of them is the outrageous case of Omar Khadr, who was a boy when he was arrested in Afghanistan. It's a child who's been in detention in Guantanamo for 8 years. It's outrageous that this is going on. There are lots of important statements by human rights organizations in the US, and first and foremost the American Civil Liberties Union, addressed to President Obama, highlighting how these developments are extremely worrying and are inconsistent with the US, with the Obama administration, inconsistent with what Obama and his own top officials said during the campaign. And of course, we know that at the same time, there was indeed no accountability for the obvious cases of imprisonment out of the law control in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So in this respect, it's quite disheartening what is happening in the US. And obviously this is an element that indeed favors the narrative for the continuation of recruitment of terrorists by the international franchise of terrorism such as Al-Qaeda. What about European accountability? I mean, the accountability is indeed inexistent. I mean, we see, at least in the UK, there is an inquiry going on about the role of the UK in the whole Iraq war, and which will obviously have implications as well for these, the way suspects of terrorism were dealt with throughout that process. But apart from that, it's a parliamentary, it's not a political inquiry. There have been individual cases in the courts in Britain, with some recognizing that some people have been indeed wrongfully targeted. But apart from that, there is no admission of responsibility. Definitely none in Germany. The inquiry that was done by the Bundestag was shelved because it was too embarrassing. And I must say, in this respect, in Germany, like in Portugal, all parties, I mean, all government parties are involved. I have tremendous responsibility. That's why they they agreed to put it under the table. They don't want disclosures. And in the case of Portugal, as you know, despite all the efforts, there was a clearly politically biased decision by the general prosecutor to shelve the case, to put it, how do you say it, shelve the case, to close the case. I have no hesitation to say it. My papers are all outside, published. People can see what was my own reply to the general prosecutor when the decision to close the case was announced. What is interesting is, on one hand, the work done by the Portuguese public prosecutors on the basis of elements that I and others brought to them about the role of Portugal in all the operation of the rendition system, and with identifying some of the people, including one of them being Omar Khadr, who might have passed via Portugal to go to Guantanamo and the other secret prisons. The Portuguese prosecutors digged up a lot of interesting material, things that I didn't know, I didn't have a clue, and that obviously deserved further investigation, but then the top decision of the general prosecutor was to shelve it because obviously pursuing the investigation would be too embarrassing, would point out to individualizing responsibilities, and that would be extremely embarrassing, to say the least, to top people in Portugal and with European responsibilities. And for the time being, I don't need to say more. I must say, as a way to atone for our sins, so to say, in this respect, Portugal was the first country to offer to the Obama administration to resettle prisoners from Guantanamo. It was Portugal, as you recall, that started that process of having people cleared from Guantanamo to be resettled in Europe. Unfortunately, Portugal sought, and I think that is something that should be brought to the credit of Portugal, to have a sort of a European-wide system to receive these people and to give them all the assurances that they need, all the rights that they need for free circulation and so on. They had already been tremendously, under tremendously human rights violations. They had to be compensated, and the minimum was to integrate them properly and, of course, give them back all the rights they are entitled as residents in Europe. But again, several countries prevented that, either with a very narrow-minded excuse, the idea, oh, this is something that the US invented, now let's not pay the price. This was the reasoning that I heard from countries like, for instance, from Austria, or others simply did not give any kind of excuse, but obviously didn't want a European program of resettlement, because this, in a way, would also imply that they would have, and that people could be led into finding out the responsibilities they had in the operation of the whole rendition system. That is definitely the case of Germany. So we have a scattered program of resettling of people from Guantanamo on a basis of bilateral discussions with the US. People here, the people who are here in Portugal, they are not entitled to travel to other European countries. It's not clear that, by the way, their status, if they have refugee status, asylum seeker status, whatever, because obviously once it will be clear, obviously they will have to be given the rights of access, free circulation. There's a crucial element in their rights, which is the right to family reunification, which is also not ensured. And I'm not just talking about Portugal in general terms. Here in Portugal, so to my knowledge, everything is still very much in limbo. And it's a dangerous limbo, because obviously we need to provide these people with all the conditions so that they can integrate in our country. That's the value in our countries. That's the value of accepting them. And of course, if you don't allow them to reunite with family, it makes their integration much more difficult. It could build resentment. It's, even from the point of view of security, it's not a wise decision to leave it in this limbo for long. As you know, I think the European Parliament played a role in this, in highlighting a lot of these responsibilities, in demanding accountability from European governments. Of course, I think we highlighted all what was needed. We were not listened to, the governments could not care, and we still are facing a lot of problems in this area. Let me say, nevertheless, that with the Lisbon Treaty, the powers of the Parliament have increased in this respect. We already showed our role in something which is actually directly linked to the fight against terrorism, which is the so-called SWIFT program. It was about the bulk transfers of data of international transactions, bank transactions that were suspect of being implicated in the financing of terrorism, that the Europeans, under the Bush administration, had agreed to transfer in bulk to the US in complete violation of our privacy laws, of the respect for human rights, of our own laws in Europe. So the Parliament last March decided to block the agreement, which had been renegotiated by the Council with the Americans, because the Lisbon Treaty gave them those powers, forced a new negotiation with the US. There are still some concerns, but definitely the new agreement has improved. Not that everything, and I'm sure Rui will tell you about that, not everything is as it should, but still we are monitoring that process. And this is an area where there are many more aspects where indeed we need to take a role. And I think one crucial element where the Parliament has to demand to revisit is the EU-US mutual legal assistance and extradition agreements that were actually signed during the Bush administrations and that are the basis for a lot of the murky, illegal aspects that are possibly going on. I think the Parliament needs, the European Parliament needs to come on that as soon as possible. Maybe this will come up in this review of the patchwork of terrorist measures that have already been highlighted by Krista. But I think this agreement in itself is a crucial piece of this, the way this cooperation has been extended and the way it indeed violates human rights. I believe, I'd like to finish by saying, I think we have a real threat. Terrorism is indeed not curbed. The people who have said that they were emphasizing the progress are every day exposed by new incidents, and there was a reference to this Nigerian terrorist whom his father had even warned the authorities, and which was completely neglected by the authorities, both European and American, which shows that indeed the way to counter terrorism is, we need a way to counter terrorism, but we need to understand what is at the heart of terrorism, what is driving terrorists, and to go behind pretexts, to go behind this justification or Islam, jihad, or whatever. Besides, in this respect, it's interesting to look at the Europol reports. Europol reports of 2010 on the EU terrorism situation and the trend that it shows actually highlighted that there was a decrease, 33% decrease in the number of terrorist attacks performed within the borders of the European Union. But at the same time, it also reported that the majority of these attacks were due to separatism terrorism. So terrorism where separatist claims are invoked, like in the case of ETA in Spain, and not necessarily Islamist, so-called Islamist terrorism. And we see that nevertheless, we are exposed in Europe as much as the US, and not just in Europe, but European interests and citizens outside Europe throughout the world are indeed object of terrorism. We need a coherent, effective strategy to fight terrorism. That strategy, we have a EU action plan on combating terrorism that was just updated by the European Council in 2009. It's on the basis of the 2004 action plan. It's a plan that talks about 3 Ps and one R: prevent, protect, pursue, and respond. If you read it, it makes sense. It's very good, comprehensive. It tries to address the causes, the reasons for why do people go and join terrorist groups and organizations. But we see that the tools to enact it have indeed performed poorly. And I agree with Kirsta, the biggest problem is indeed the lack of, the weakness of sharing information. Sharing intelligence is very important. Inside each country, in our country, we know also the rivalries among the different police forces, the rivals among intelligence services, actually prevent from a proper sharing of information. Therefore, this also undermines the proper analysis. What happens at the national level happens at the European level, happens at in the transnational level, namely in the very important cooperation between Europe and the United States. And that's why incidents like the Nigerian boy attempt were neglected. And that's why, for instance, also homegrown phenomena tend to be neglected. In the US, definitely. I mean, there was the Fort Hood case. There was also the Times Square bombing. It's a new aspect of the phenomena. The nationals of the country actually being the ones who are recruited to perform terrorist acts within each country. And it's also very inconsistent even at another level. We just had recently the European Parliament, the EU coordinator against terrorism, Mr. Gilles de Kerchove, come to our subcommittee on security and defense to brief us on the it's much more than emerging, it's the blatant terrorist threat now in the Sahel, very near to us, here in the north of Africa, with a new organization which is actually the so-called ACMI, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is a derivation from the old Salafist groups in Algeria, but who are now actually kidnapping Spanish and French citizens in the Sahel region. And despite all the theories, despite all the doctrine, despite the action plan by the EU in combating terrorism, what do we see? We see, for instance, the Spanish government paying ransoms, so getting their citizens released because they pay ransoms. And obviously those ransoms are huge sums in countries like Mali or Mauritania or Niger, so they will enable a reinforcement of these terrorist networks and the technologies and the armaments that they need to and so on. While, of course, the French have not been paying ransoms so far, but they have had their hostages, some of them killed. This is, paying ransoms is totally contradictory with the UN recommendations, and this really shows the level of discoordination among European countries, even at this very essential way to react to the terrorist threat. Again, in the European Parliament, I'm now in charge of a report on analyzing the EU action plan on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. It's a plan that was adopted again December 2009. I will be soon, I already use this opportunity to invite you all to, I will be organizing an audition on the 15th of October on that to see how that plan is already integrated by our national authorities, be it in the civil protection, be it in the intelligence and police forces. And what do I see? That this plan is very weak, and it has actually been diluted compared with what the Commission was proposing, and it's very weak. When we know that today one of the biggest threats, it's actually the threat of a nuclear dirty bomb, and that can come not out of the use by a state, but actually by falling into the hands of a terrorist group. And when you look at the situation in Pakistan, a country that has nuclear weapons, where even a major natural disaster can disrupt control of the state assets and could actually facilitate the control of nuclear materials by a terrorist network, and knowing how the technologies have been disseminated. The internet has helped, obviously, the spread of this kind of technologies. That is indeed very, very disturbing, and it's very hard indeed to control both materials and the technologies. But definitely our institutions are not doing a good job, because first and foremost, they are not doing a good job in terms of sharing the information, and they are not investing in what is absolutely central, which is to indeed invest in human intelligence. I don't know how many people in our intelligence service, and Portugal is an important country, in my opinion, because it serves as a logistical country for terrorist networks. ETA, obviously, it has been already admitted, and definitely Al-Qaeda. The reason why I believe, and I don't want to sound alarmist, but the reason why we have not yet been targeted with a major attempt is because we are too useful for the logistics of these terrorist networks, because of the soft controls in our own country. That's my perception from all that I've been gathering. So I believe there is a threat. I believe we need to be much more effective at all levels. Human intelligence is a crucial area. Sharing of information is essential. Then all sorts of other policies are essential. I very much agree with what Mr. Donjins has said, that if we don't uphold human rights in this respect, the rule of law, we are actually playing into the hands of terrorists. All what they want is exactly to destroy the rule of law, is to destroy our democracies where human rights are respected. If we are the ones to lower our level of respect for human rights and the rule of law with the pretext of fighting terrorism, we are playing into the hands of terrorists. And we are often also doing this also in the way we act in third countries, not just regarding our action in repressing or going after terrorists in our own countries, but actually in our policies in third countries. And I can only tell you that I've been very worried that the EU, for instance, is now moving to train soldiers from Somalia in Uganda. With the pretext of forming the army for the Somali, the TFG, the transitional government in Somalia. The transitional government in Somalia is nothing, it's a fiction. And by actually training these military, supposedly in Uganda, to bring back to Somalia, we might actually be training guys who will end up serving Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group that is getting stronger and stronger in Somalia. Thanks to what? Thanks to the invasion by Ethiopia of Somalia in 2006, which the Bush administration pushed and where we Europeans kept silent. So, I mean, you see how counterproductive are some of our actions, both in the international arena and inside our countries in fighting terrorism. If we don't account for the mistakes we have done in the so-called extraordinary renditions program, in the so-called war on terror, we will not be able to effectively fight terrorism. We will be playing into the hands of terrorism.